Hi, I'm Stewart Spinks and welcome to episode 325 of my podcast, Beekeeping Short and Sweet. It's incredible to think that today, the 25th of October 2024, our local temperature is hitting 19 degrees Celsius. It all seems so lovely right now, but what are the implications for our honeybees as we head through the winter? Listen in for my thoughts. Beekeeping Short and Sweet, a beekeeping podcast for the inquisitive beekeeper with a short attention span. A beekeeper, in fact, just like me. Hi everyone, welcome back for another scorching podcast, and we have to start with the weather. As I mentioned in the introduction, I'm recording this on Friday the 25th of October 2024, and we're expecting today's top temperature here in Norwich to hit 19 degrees Celsius. Now that seems unseasonably high. We always expect a little warmer weather in the early autumn before the colder weather starts to take hold, but that's normally in September, and here we are almost in November. That said, the highest ever recorded October temperature here in the UK was just shy of 30 degrees Celsius, and that was in 2011, hitting an incredible 29.9 degrees Celsius, and that was recorded in Gravesend, but on October the 1st, 2011. That's almost 4 weeks earlier than we are right now. Is this a result of climate change perhaps, or just the normal swing of natural conditions that affects the planet by everything that acts upon it? I watched a TV series the other evening. It was Professor Brian Cox talking about the solar system that we're all part of. It certainly makes you feel a small and insignificant part of what's out there, but still, I don't think anyone can argue that we're not having an impact on our own planet in a detrimental way, in that our environment seems to be shifting from that Goldilocks zone that we've enjoyed and unfortunately appear to be destroying. Bringing it back to my honeybees, and hopefully yours too, these changes in weather conditions can have a major impact on their survival, particularly as we eventually get to some colder weather and winter begins proper. I always looked at the year planner and thought of it as 4 distinct periods: spring, summer, autumn and winter, with winter being December, January and February. But it all seems to be shifting, compressing and extending at different times of the year. As the climate scientists say, weather events are becoming more extreme, and like us, our honeybees have to be able to adapt to them. For the most part, I think, with a little intervention from the beekeeper, most honeybee colonies are going to be just fine for the coming few years. Even those who face the newest challenge of the yellow-legged Asian hornet seem to be able to manage, with varying degrees of success, it has to be said, but survive they are. My thoughts today are a repeating message, but it is an important one that really focuses on what could likely happen in our colonies as we get to the latter part of the winter. And from what I've already mentioned, you can probably tell I'm beginning to wonder if that will be at the end of February, early March, or if we get another beast from the east, April, late April, or even May. I think the last really early spring that I enjoyed was during the COVID lockdown period, but that seems quite a long time ago now. So what am I rambling on about? Well, here's the thing, and as usual, it's a very open-ended statement because there are so many variables in beekeeping. Honeybee colonies at this time of the year would normally be taking it quite frugally, not wasting too much energy and using their food stores a little at a time. I'm off out this afternoon, glad to say I've pretty much recovered from the bug that I picked up midweek, and I'm heading over to one of our apiaries to just get some fresh air and watch the bees flying. I have no doubt that when I arrive at the apiary, the air will be full of honeybees because the temperature is going to be so high. Bees out foraging, on toilet flights, water collection duty, and possibly even a little propolis collection will all be taking place, but there's likely to be a diminishing return for the foragers, unless of course they can find some local parks or gardens with late flowering plants to enjoy. All that activity requires energy, and that comes from the food stores our colonies have, supplemented with anything foraged, of course. But I would imagine that bees out collecting water use approximately as much energy as those collecting nectar and pollen. So there will be lots of hungry workers all wanting a meal, and that will deplete the stores that they have. Now, this isn't a major challenge for them right now, and certainly in hefting our colonies, I'm finding some very healthy weight of stores held within the hives. The prolonged warmer weather has allowed colonies to continue to forage, and with the assistance of us beekeepers providing some additional carbs in the form of fondant, they've probably loaded up very nicely over the past couple of months. A word of warning here for anyone who's following instructions from a book about how much and when to feed. These books talk very much in average terms, an average hive in an average year with an average winter. The traditional time frame for treatment and feeding, for me at least, has always been treat in August and feed in September. However, if you fed a prescribed amount of syrup in September and no more, you may find the colonies getting a little light into the new year. All of this late autumn activity comes at a cost, you see. It becomes harder for workers to find a decent source of nectar and pollen. Fewer plants results in more pollinators fighting over available resources. As an aside, it sounds a little like the direction of our species is heading if we're not careful, everyone fighting for their own survival. It's a rather damning indictment of the human race, isn't it? Anyway, as the warm days continue and the bees go out to forage, stores will become depleted, and the mindful beekeeper will continue to heft, judge what stores the colonies have, and allow for some top-up feed of fondant at some point, probably into the new year. As I say, there's no immediate rush or panic. Heft, and heft again. Get some fondant now, store it in the garage, and have it ready for use when you feel necessary. One other point here is that if you do feed some fondant, bring it into the house a few days before you plan to feed so that you can warm it up a little and make it pliable. Just make sure not to leave it on the carpet where the liquid sugars can run out and make a mess. Personal experience speaking here, folks. Part of taking care of your bees is not just judging when to start feeding, but also when to stop feeding. This requires a careful and watchful eye on the calendar, the weather, and your bees. Once again, we're challenged with so many variables that there is no simple formula for feeding bees through the latter part of the winter and into the spring. One of the key challenges is making sure the bees have enough food, while at the same time making sure that they also have enough space to build a growing brood nest for a fast start in the new year. One of the considerations for beekeepers is this: where colonies have stored and capped large amounts of food stores, any additional food in the form of fondant is likely to be utilised first, leaving the capped stores in place. It makes perfect sense, right? I mean, if at home I have some frozen broccoli, but I'm given some fresh broccoli too, I'm going to keep the frozen broccoli in the freezer and use the more immediately available fresh stuff. The freezer remains full. If our colonies don't eat some of their food, stored in cells around the brood nest area in preparation for spring growth, it could quite easily lead to swarming very early on in the season, just because the beekeeper was trying to do the right thing. I know it's complicated, isn't it? Well, it's not really. But anyway, another consideration for us beekeepers is what happens if spring doesn't arrive and winter just keeps a firm grip on conditions. Once we start feeding, we need to make sure we don't suddenly stop and see our colonies starve. Again, keep hefting those hives. I've found this situation with quite a number of our colonies just this season. We had such a stop-start spring, and when I eventually did get into some hives and carry out those all-important first inspections, we discovered that many colonies were very, very close to a point of starvation. It's that collision of a growing colony population in the spring and a lack of immediate and surplus food. I wouldn't say that once you start feeding, you have to continue. Rather, once you start feeding, you should monitor the situation more closely and, should it be required, continue to feed. Thinking back to the beast from the east, we were putting fondant on colonies throughout March until the weather finally broke. It was actually quite an interesting start to the season. The weather eventually warmed up into April, and it was like the bees had no worries at all. It was just us beekeepers. The point here is to remember to let the colony eat through at least some of its capped stores so it can develop a larger brood nest into the spring, and maybe give you a week or two of extra time to get new frames with foundation made up ready to swap out. In other news, I have a replacement thermostatic controller for the Appy Melter. I can't recall if I mentioned the recent failure of the top heater thermostat. However, no harm done, and I now have a new controller with what appears to be lots of wires and a couple of printed sheets of instructions. I'm going to take a look at it to see if I can cope with the electrics or not, and then probably get an electrician in to fix it for me. I'll post a couple of pictures showing what I'm up against in the next few days. Luckily, I've had the Thorn Beehive's warming cabinet here as a backup. I know it only takes 2 buckets, but it's been really useful in warming up some honey for bottling. In other news, we finally extracted the last few frames of heather honey. I think we've possibly managed to peak at just under 20 kilograms. Not bad from 18 hives. Now, obviously, I'm joking here. It's been very frustrating and disappointing this year, but we're not giving up on it, and I'm already hoping we can find a better location for next year. Same gamekeeper, just a different spot on his moor. I'm already contemplating next year's beekeeping, you see. I don't know about you lovely folk, but I absolutely love planning for the new season. Now, I like to think I'm an optimistic and positive kind of chap. Obviously, we all have our moments, but for the most part, I always try to see the upside to everything and be positive about stuff that hasn't gone so well. I'm actually looking forward to next spring already, as I have some really fun plans for our business and hope to share those once we have something more concrete in place. My first point of focus is, of course, spring, a tricky time for both bees and beekeepers. Thinking more about the physical beekeeping, I'm reminded that it was only February this year that I had my little health scare. And with that in mind, I continue to focus on making life a little easier for myself. And before you suggest it, no, retirement isn't an option. I'd miss all that we do in beekeeping too much. So really, a little less physical stress is required, and that means either we keep our honey production colony numbers down, or I employ a few strong youngsters to do the heavy lifting, as it were. Well, we're not really set up financially to do that right now, so we'll have to focus on maintaining our lower production numbers and build other parts of the beekeeping business to compensate. I'm thinking that this year, with around 50 production colonies, we did okay, and so sticking to that number next season seems reasonable and, more importantly, manageable. I think I've already mentioned that we're producing a lot more nucleus colonies, and this is where my focus will be in the spring. Spring is the greatest part of our time managing colonies for swarm prevention, or if things get out of control, as they did this year, firefighting those swarming colonies, because at one point it felt like we were turning up in an apiary only to find another swarm had gone over the hedge line. To help with that, we're going to stick with the double brooding as many colonies as we can, but earlier in the season next year, and that should really help in a couple of ways. First off, it will give growing colonies much needed additional space when brood nests are expanding, and a half a dozen frames of emerging brood suddenly overwhelms the available space within a hive. Secondly, it will provide us with lots of extra brood frames of drawn comb, perfect to help smaller splits grow and develop more quickly. Once we get colonies growing into the second brood boxes, it feels like the pressure is off a little for any of those colonies that throw up a few queen cells. You see, we can use the extra brood frames to assist with splits and simply replace those frames with foundation in the stronger colonies. We can then start thinking about honey production and select those colonies that look likely to continue to build without swarming. These are the ones that just keep getting bigger and bigger without any sign of queen cells. They're the top colonies in our apiaries and the ones that we take a special interest in. I'll revisit and no doubt revise the plans for next year as we head into and out of winter. For those of you listening as supporters on Patreon, just to let you know, I'm off to hospital on Tuesday for a little day procedure on my heart. I'm told it's a straightforward operation, but that I'll have to rest up for the following week. So although there may not be any videos, I'll be able to answer any questions you might have from the comfort of my sofa using the iPad. And I'll probably be getting bored, so do get in touch. Well, that's it for this week. Don't forget to check out my website www.norfolk-honey.co.uk and for my latest videos and podcasts with more updates, tips and techniques, it's the same Patreon page www.patreon.com/Norfolk Honey. And remember, I'm Stewart Spinks and that was Beekeeping Short and Sweet.